I just can't tell you. It feels like it's been more than a week. Did we meet last week? I think we did. Anyway, a lot every week. So much happens. It feels like a year. But it's so good to be with you and to see you. I'm looking forward to the day, like many of you are, when we can be together in person, as St. Paul once said to the Christians in Rome, when we can encourage one another with a spiritual gift. We can do that remotely, but it's so much better in person. But that day will come. In the meantime, we have this way of gathering, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for you and your ministry. So let's get started. I've been supplementing my daily practice, as I've shared before, with this little resource, just because it seems like the ancient tools of our faith tradition feel more relevant than ever in these times that we're living in, because the words that we invent feel like they often fall short. So I want to share with you, this is the reading from Saturday, June 13th, excuse me, from Mark chapter 7. Jesus said to the Pharisees, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, 'Whatever support you might have had from me is korban,' that is an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making the word void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do so many things like this." So I think this is a very relevant text for our topic at hand today, and which, as I've said here before, should probably be our topic at hand every day. But the recent events of the last month have brought a fresh urgency to this matter of racial injustice and other injustices in our society that have felt urgent for a lot of people for, well, over 400 years. I want to confess that, and I think I'm not alone in this, that we, as Lutherans, I as well, have often used the gospel, the way we understand it, as a path to quietude, as a way to suppress our public voices, the proclamation of justification by faith alone. I think Lutherans have historically, especially Lutherans, where Lutheranism is rooted among people of privilege, have gravitated towards a sense of the gospel that doesn't always include, or often does not include, how we live out our lives publicly, as though the self that God, the person that God claims in God's righteousness, is a disembodied spirit that has nothing to do in the world, or no body or action to undertake in the world. And so this is, as I said, it feels like a fresh urgency for us. And but it's not. And as many of my brothers and sisters in the Conference of Bishops, Black and Brown brothers and sisters, and other people with which we want to ally, have said, you're late to the party if you're just getting started. But I know there's been various work in our synod throughout the years. I don't know how earnest it's been, but we want to be more earnest now. And so I'm starting to pulling together a commission on racial equity. I've invited you to nominate yourself or others. And I think it's sadly, it's only a beginning, but that's where we have to start somewhere. I've been reading Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning. Perfect example of the way people of privilege can comfortably ignore reality. He looks at the history of racism in the United States through the lens of 4 different people who focused a lot on race. So Cotton Mather, the great scholar and preacher, went to Harvard when he was 11 years old, was the leading scholar in the United States when he was 17. But Cotton Mather Thomas Jefferson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois. So through these lenses, he looks at the history of racism. I was a student of 19th century American literature and studied Cotton Mather a lot, and never was brought to my attention, or never did I bother to investigate the fact that he was one of the leading proponents of slavery in the United States. Maybe you knew that. I didn't know that. So one of the great founders of the intellectual tradition in the United States. So I'm learning, and I hope you are too. And today we have opportunity to learn from our friend and scholar, Dr. Anna Madsen, as well, on how we proclaim the gospel in these interesting times and do so faithfully. So I want to focus our time in some prayer, and then we'll handle some business and announcements, and then we'll begin our conversation with Dr. Madsen. So this is a prayer from the Prayer Book for the Armed Forces. It is one that's gone with me in various places around the world. And this happens to be a prayer from Kenya. Let us pray. From the cowardice that dare not face truth, from the laziness that is concerned with half-truth, from the arrogance that thinks it knows all truth, good Lord, deliver us. Amen. All right, Chris, what do we got?
Hello, everyone. I have a few announcements for you all. First thing I'm going to put in the chat is a link to a Google form. I've been working on our databases, and I need your treasurer's information. So I'll put a Google form link, and you can type in your treasurer information there. Also, if your council president has come to 2 or more of our Monday night meetings that have now switched to every other week, or an extra we'll do every week if things change a lot. But if they've been to 2 or more of those Monday calls, please chat either me or publicly who that is, so I can mark on a chart that I have, because we're going to send some special invitations to people who have not been attending those.
So 2 or fewer, right, Chris?
No, 2 or more, because then I'll know.
Then we'll send them. Oh, send them to the ones that haven't. Okay.
Perfect. Got it. And next Thursday we have our first go at small groups. We're going to do it at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. So I will. There's a Google form to sign up for that, so we can prepare people for topics. That's in the Northern Lights, and I'll stick that up on our social media so it doesn't get confused in our chat. And then tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, I invite you, along with Bishop Bill and many people across the ELCA, to be part of the Emmanuel 9 worship service. It's the 5th anniversary tomorrow, and so Bishop Eaton and many others are putting together a worship service that will be at noon Eastern time, so 11 our time. So you're invited to be part of that. Also, fresh off the press, Wednesdays, July 1st and 8th, Dr. Beverly Wallace will be leading webinars for us on pastoral care. It will be 2 sessions. The first will be on pastoral care, wellness, and ministry, taking care of who you are. And then the second one will be more of caretaking, walking with people, particularly in this time of COVID-19 and the world in crisis. So I think that's a lot of information. Please make sure you chat to me if your council president has been to 2 or more, and then I'll pop up that treasurer Google form as well. I think that's it, Bishop Bill.
Thanks, Chris. So we can't have a meeting where we don't talk a little bit about COVID-19 and returning to in-person worship, right? So I continue along with the other 5 bishops here in Minnesota to advise, and that's what it is. It's advice as your pastor of your synod, of our synod, that we wait until it's safe for everyone to gather. That, as I've said, may be a long time. So we've been using this image of, the prophet Jeremiah, when God speaks through Jeremiah to the exiles to work for the good of the city, build homes and take spouses and plan to live in this space for a while. And you've been doing great. And I know that many of you are experiencing a lot of pressure. And I know that some of you have decided in different ways to return to in-person worship in various ways. So we're finding it possible to serve our communities through lots of creative means, such as this one and others. And folks are finding ways to provide the sacrament of Holy Communion. And we have resources on our website to aid and assist with that, and with lots of guidance. And I encourage you to look at that. I'll be visiting with a congregation later this week that's trying to wrestle with these matters. And I'm happy to visit with your congregations as well, if that's helpful. Remember that we've advised you form a SMART team that will, of folks that know some things about medicine and public health, in order to provide some wisdom and guidance. And while the state of Minnesota has some overall guidance, it's really important that you tailor your decisions to what's happening locally. In most of our counties right now, because of the time of year we're in, while the state is starting to level off a little bit as we technically enter phase 1, although for the good of the economy, we're actually entering phase 3 for economic reasons. But from a health perspective, from a public health perspective, entering phase 1, our counties, many of our counties though, are in a different space. They're actually seeing cases increase. And so that's something you need to pay attention to, your local public health folks. And we've got links on our website for how to figure out who those folks are. So thank you once again for your good work in ministry. So now I get to introduce my friend, Anna Madsen, Dr. Anna Madsen. I think we go quite a ways back, but so you were probably like 12 years old when we first met or something like that. This is her book, I Can Do No Other. It's an awesome book. I'm going to read an excerpt here. I do believe a new reformation is afoot. It is a reformation of homiletic expectations, of ecclesial identity, of theological understandings, of political and social engagement, and of communal commitment. We are simply being called to put faith into action and to see that faith is deed as much as, and perhaps more than, word. So Anna also has the OMG Center for Theological Conversation, and she has the Spent Dandelion Retreat Center up on the beautiful North Shore. And I'm really grateful to have you with us today, Dr. Madsen, and I'll turn it over to you. We got to get you in. There you go.
Yeah.
We got you.
Hey, it is good to actually see you for the first time in quite a while, although we've had some good conversations. And insofar as you read that segment of the book, one can argue I have actually nothing more to add to that. That's kind of the sum gist of everything. But I've got 20 minutes. I'm going to do my best to honor that 20 minutes. Although I've got a lot to cover. What I'd like to do, what did you call this? A prophetic something or another, an interesting time. So you're becoming quickly a Minnesotan, because that's like a multi-purpose word, interesting. So it is that I would like to see if I can address some of these matters by way of three different angles. So one would be the first commandment, to come at things by way of the first commandment. The second would be to talk about what I think is a false dichotomy between the prophetic and the pastoral. And the third way, the third angle is to think through, or at least pitch out the idea that there must be a different way of thinking about strengthening both the collegial and also the denominational fabric of support for rostered leaders when they do engage in what is commonly understood to be prophetic work. But before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of a brief context of some recent familiarity I have with how difficult this can be, so that you know that I'm not speaking from some kind of North Shore ivory tower or lighthouse, as the case may be. And also because I think, and for good reason, I hate to admit it, oftentimes theologians are accused of being maybe too theoretical. And I understand that, but as of, so to speak, as for me and my house, I honestly and earnestly believe that theology doesn't matter unless it matters. And that is essentially, right, the theology of the cross, that theology gets messy when it gets real. And I think that's precisely why we're here on this communal call. So very briefly, we moved here from South Dakota in 2016. We have just this amazing spot of 20 acres of North Shore woods. I joke that the closest you'll ever hear me sound like Sarah Palin is that, and honestly, really right now, I can see Lake Superior from here. And so we have this gorgeous space, and we have a retreat center above the garage. When we first came here, we thought that we would be using that in compensation, so to speak, for somebody to be able to care for my son, who this week actually 16 years ago suffered a traumatic brain injury in an accident that also killed my husband. And so trying to figure out how to make everything work was crucial for me. And coming from South Dakota, where frankly there isn't a lot of support, as even I talked about it, for people with special needs, that was one way I thought maybe I could make ends meet. Come to find out that there's tremendous support here for people like Coral and our family. And so that allowed me to be able to open up my imagination for different uses of this space. It became then the Spent Dandelion. But in order to do that, I can't just hang out a shingle. I have to get a ton of approvals, which is appropriate and right and good, including zoning modifications. So I applied for that. There was a public hearing that was held in December of 2016. I invited people to an open house earlier so that they could kind of see who I am and how we are. Sent out postcards, not least of all with a blog, a link to my blog. Unfortunately, I hadn't really thought through this, and the most immediate latest blog was one called Out Amosing Amos. And in this particular blog, it had taken me 3 weeks to come down from Trump being elected. And in this particular blog, I called out 3 groups of people. I called out those who voted for Trump, as well as those who didn't vote. But I also called out the Democrats, and I called out the church. However, the people, there are quite a few Trump supporters where I am, and they were bothered by this. And so the details of what they did are in a blog called The Spent Dandelion and Truth Mattering. So rather than take up time to be able to go into all of the details of what they did, which was stark, you can read that. But suffice it to say that they orchestrated lies, and they called into a Fox News show to smear both me and what I had done in South Dakota, including, by the way, I had harbored terrorists at our home from Tehran, and that the ELCA actually wanted to create a mosque here on the property. That was really what we are about. And there are sound bites to all of this. I'm not, and all of those are linked. But they're real, what I found out at the time of the zoning was that they were upset because they came up with a lie. And all of this was retribution for my words against Trump. That was it. But they said that I was really wanting to build, quote unquote, a group home for 30 Somalis. And that was not allowable. So it was a confrontation of fairly epic proportions, to the point where even 2 years later, when I was presenting in the area, the sheriffs had to be there with guns to protect me because there were so many people who were upset at what I had said in this particular blog. What I'm wanting to say this because I want you to know that everything that I say is not about the theory, but I understand the scary realities of the implications of what one speaks. On the upside, we have two really great big dogs right now that make me feel a lot safer, but this isn't theory. I understand that this has real implications, and so I get it. But the problem is, in a pesky way, I'm baptized, right? And we are all baptized. And insofar as we are baptized Christians, we're initiated right into this communion of the saints, this community of people, of those who believe that Jesus did not stay dead, and that faith in that news, it changes absolutely everything. That little piece, right? This baptism, this initiation into the life of faith in the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, it is a distinct disadvantage in days like these for those who would like a life of safe keisters and, I think, consistently happy parishioners. But simultaneously being baptized, I believe, is the most freeing of possible things, possible news, right? I'm convinced and regularly convicted, but also freed by the words of my late mentor, Walt Bowman, who said, whenever he was given the chance, now that you know that death doesn't win, there is more to do with your lives than preserve them. And I'm going to say that again because it's so powerful. Now that you know that death does not win, there is more to do with your lives than preserve them, which of course invites conversation about how it is in manifold ways that we do tend to try and preserve our lives personally, professionally, congregationally, and arguably denominationally as well. But moreover, I am an ordained rostered leader called to steward this good news, literally the gospel. That's what the word good news means, euangelion, in the world. And as rostered leaders, we are called not, frankly, to serve our context, but to serve the gospel in our context, right? And that changes absolutely everything. And it's directly related to this first point I want to make about the first commandment. So as Bill noted, because I have a low friend threshold, I'm passionate enough about this next thing that I wrote a book about it. I really do believe that the most pressing thing facing the church these days is our allegiance or fidelity to the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And I love that implicitly God's acknowledging that we got options. One of the ways that I started to think about this was soon after we arrived here, and I had noticed some beautiful oarboats off on the horizon of the lake, and I took pictures of them and I posted them on Facebook. And then not too long, but long enough for me to quite not make the connection, I got a Facebook message request from some guy who asked if I'd ever been on an oarboat, which I thought was creepy. But then I did some kind of poking around to figure out who this guy was, and it turns out that he had been an ELCA pastor. Some of you might know his name. James Bittner is his name. And then he thought better of it, and he decided that he wanted to become the first mate on an oarboat. And so he did. And long and short of it is that my daughter Elsa and I were able to get a tour of this oarboat. And when we were up close, we were able to be on the oarboat was by the docks as the oar was being poured in. And he told us to pay attention to the 5 lights. There were 5 lights on either end of the ship, and the 2 outer ones were red and the middle one was white. And he said, listen for the mates, and the mates are going to be hollering out, she's not trimmed to the white light, which made me punch him and say, people say that about me all the time. But the point is that when the oar is too much on one side or another, the ship tilts. It's not aligned, right? And so it has to be properly trimmed. The word aligned in Hebrew is tzedek. So Joseph Sittler wrote a piece, the late Joseph Sittler wrote a piece about how your car, if it's out of whack, it needs to go to the mechanic to be properly aligned. But the word tzedek is also the word for righteous, right? Which is cool. So if we are properly aligned, if we are properly trimmed, we are righteous, right? The question, I think, is to what light are we trimmed? To what are we aligning ourselves in? Is it a righteous alignment, or are we out of alignment, right? And so I would argue that what we are called to be about is to be aligned to the gospel. But just as you were mentioning, Bill, I think that particularly we in the Lutheran heritage, we have reduced the gospel to this news that Jesus is forgiven, or that our sins are forgiven, that Jesus has forgiven our sins. We've reduced the gospel to the notion of forgiveness, which contextually makes some sense in terms of historically what Luther was having to fuss with the indulgences and so forth. But I would argue that has done tremendous harm, not to mention a curtailing of understanding of what the gospel actually is. I would argue that the forgiveness of the sins is an effect of the gospel, but it's not the gospel. The gospel, literally again, good news, evangelion, news being something that affects you, is that Jesus is risen. And so if we say that the gospel is that your sins are forgiven, then we make the gospel relevant only to the sinners and not to those who have been sinned upon. We make the gospel relevant only to those who inflict the pain, but not to those who suffer it. So, right, 16 years ago at the time of the accident, I didn't need to be told that my sins were forgiven. I needed to hear about healing. I needed to hear about hope. I needed to hear about comfort and about death not being the last word. And 3 weeks ago, when and since George Floyd was killed, those who have been crying out against white privilege and racism and who have been reduced to having to make the case that Black lives matter, not in contrast, right, to other lives, but in contrast to being societally, as a matter of course, dismissed and disrespected and disregarded and, in point of fact, destroyed by police assaults and lynchings. His family and the Black community and the protesters, they haven't been crying out to learn whether they're justified. They're crying out for justice, right? And so if we as rostered leaders focus on justification, again, as our Lutheran tradition is wont to do, we absolve the sinners of the injustice time and time again, even if we mention it as a sin, but we don't speak a word to either redeeming them from a pattern of injustice, nor to those who suffer a pattern of injustice. We are trimmed to avoiding conflict and avoiding stirring the pot, but we're not trimmed to the gospel. So I believe my New Testament professor, Mark Allen Powell, was right when he said that the primary message of Luke's gospel was that just as the poor and the oppressed were to be redeemed from their poverty and their oppression, so too were the wealthy and the privileged to be redeemed from their riches and their insular status. So if we preach only about the forgiveness of some amorphous sins, we console the sinners, right? But we do not console those who suffer their sin. If indeed such people are even in the pews, given that there's all too often no word spoken to them that frees their spirits, right? And secondly, I fear that there's this false dichotomy between pastoral and prophetic. I wrote a blog about it just last week, so you can take a peek at that at the omgcenter.com. But the blog is called The God of Meeting People Where They Are. And in it, I stated that when we decide to meet our people where they are, we can't help but simultaneously leave other people, the very people who need the rest of us, right, to move from where we are. We can't help but leave them where they are. So when we hear the phrase, I need to meet my people where they are, I think what we should actually hear, especially these days, is less even the best of intentioned pastoral move and more the hidden message, hidden sometimes I think even to us as leaders, that we're supposed to be okay with that, down with it, content with it, because in point of fact, they're actually not our people, right? Those people aren't us. They're other. But the wretched thing of it is that nobody is where they are supposed to be these days. And moreover, I'm convinced that the white rostered tendency to want to meet people of privilege where they are is precisely what keeps the status quo quoing, so to speak, namely that precisely that which keeps everybody where they aren't supposed to be. I'll say it again and again and again, that the pastoral is the prophetic and the prophetic is the pastoral. We've all heard that the time isn't right and they're just not ready for that yet. Again, we have to meet them where they are, but I fear that in our very well-intentioned attempt to wait for that right time, whenever that might be, it's not we rostered leaders who are waiting, but rather those who suffer because of our silence that gives our parishioners the sense that aligning, trimming ourselves with the present and the palpable powers that in these last 3 years have separated children from parents, that put children in cages, that build walls, that refuse supports to healing, that mock people with disabilities, that make it harder for families to provide food for their families, that both sides, the KKK and protesters, that remove protections for the environment, remove protections for GLBTQIA people. Is it all righteous and consistent with the gospel, with our baptisms, and with the one whom they identify by name, at least, as Christians, right? Because the Jesus in whom they claim to believe would not be down. I do not believe with any of this. But if we put a spin, I think, on this notion of meeting people where they are, we might have another helpful take on matters. So if you're a pastor, a rostered leader of a largely white congregation, and you opt to meet your people where they are, you'll tend to meet them in a place of white privilege and racism then, therefore, both perceived and latent. But when you do, when you meet them where they really are, as opposed to where they think they are, you actually help leading your people into repentance. You announce the possibility of restoration to all the people of God, and you help bring all the people of God to where everyone ought to be. And last and very briefly, I would hope that we could engage in conversation about figuring out a different way to be supportive both collegially and denominationally. I wrote a much longer blog about this, and it's tediously long to be honest, but it's called Beholden to the Buck. You can find that on the online too. Everything that I'm encouraging rostered leaders to do these days is scary. To circle back to my initial story, I get it, I do. But when there's so much at stake, I would therefore love to mull, how do we actually support each other better? And so one of the concerns I have is that congregations are largely dependent on local offerings. And that adds a whole nother layer of concern about speaking prophetically slash pastorally in our context. Because if we speak about the candid implications of the gospel, we run the risk of, frankly, annoying people, which means that these same people could either cause dissension within our communities or they could up and leave. And when they do that, they could take other people, and they certainly could take their offerings with them. Monies, which in point of fact do heaps of good in the congregation and in the wider world by providing electricity and heat and salaries and mission monies. And so I'm wondering, is there a way that we could begin to reconsider how we support our congregation so that for noble reasons, we're afraid of harming the good that our offerings do, we temper our proclamation and our teachings to ignoble effect? Is there a way that we could then show clergy solidarity with one another so that if a rostered leader is encountering pushback, we could have a group of rostered leaders show up in one way or another to say, nope, actually that is gospel legit? And is there a way that we could rethink congregational support? In Germany, for example, it's supported by the state. That isn't a possibility. But then rostered leaders have the freedom to be able to not have to risk irritating people within the congregation because they know that there will be a steady income to support the work that they do. And is there a way that we could support clergy and congregations who suffer a cut in either offerings or position by developing some kind of financial support, either congregationally or familially, instead of suffering alone for their righteousness? perhaps later we can have some time to give a couple of South Dakota examples of that regarding gambling and the beef industry. And last, I would encourage you to read up on mentors of the faith. We were just talking, Bishop, the other day about how in seminary we encourage people to read Bonhoeffer, but when they actually live it out, it gets a little dicier. But still, to return to Bonhoeffer, to read up on Kai Munk, who is an amazing Danish martyr and a family friend on my father's side. So I wrote a blog about him, and Martin Niemöller, other people who really did engage in resistance to personal detrimental effect, and yet their fidelity made a difference in the righteous ways of God. With that, I bet you I've gone over, but quite a few things to throw this community's way, albeit briefly.
Thank you, Anna. So we, I put in the chat line, part of my morning prayer is the Benedictus. And it always impresses me how the blessing is to give God's people knowledge of salvation by the forgiveness of their sins. It's just the beginning of what God intends with us, right? It's, and then in the blessing, Zechariah goes on to talk about setting people free.
Yeah.
So we have a slight technology glitch in that we are not able to get you into a chat room. We will be able to next time. But is there a question that you'd like to throw out there for us, Dr. Madsen, for us to just wrestle with here in this large group for a bit, or something that would be?
I could, although if there are, I see that there are chats. I haven't had a chance to look at any of them at all. Are there questions that have already welled up in the chat that that people would like to throw out?
So there's a question from Steve Norby. I'm not sure I understand the question, Steve. Maybe you can say it's a little more. As a covenant, what are we to learn from the wisdom of our lay people?
I guess.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Steve.
Just, when it comes to the call, it's a covenant with us and our lay folks. And obviously we also have our authority with regard to the gospel. But there's also a dialogue, I believe, that I've learned so much from my lay people that it's not always one way. That there's things that I need to learn from them, I believe, to hear a prophetic word effectively.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that the gospel has to be spoken contextually. And so one of my favorite moments serving as in a small congregation in Badger, South Dakota was when, maybe favorite, that isn't quite the right way to say it, but it was a tragic instance that gave rise to a compliment that I appreciated, and it had to do with a biker who died right during Sturgis, as people were making their way to the Sturgis bike rally, and so here I was to preach to Sturgis, and I had no concept of biker rallies whatsoever. So did I do my homework? Yes, I did. And so dove into the lingo and the framework, and I preached accordingly. And afterwards, one of the guys shuffled up to me and he said, I don't mean to be rude, Pastor Ma'am, but are you a biker babe under them robes of yours? I still love that all these years later. And so right, had I preached in a way that wouldn't have connected, I wouldn't have preached, right? However, I think it's crucial that we pay attention, that we are preaching something to these people, and that the something has to be a thing. We have to figure out what that thing is. And so while it might be translated in a variety of different ways and contexts, there is a consistency within the gospel. Like when we think about who Jesus is, and I oftentimes will have people, help identify who was Jesus, because it makes a difference, right? That a certain person was risen from the dead, not just anybody, but a certain person. This was a person who fed and welcomed, healed, consoled, got angry at injustice, right, et cetera, et cetera. And that when this particular person was risen from the dead, what that said, among other things, is that Jesus's agenda was aligned, so to speak, with God's agenda. And that when we are audacious to identify ourselves as Christians, right, as followers of Jesus, that means that we're following that agenda too. And so if we are in any way conveying that an agenda that is inconsistent with the resurrection, the gospel, the life of Jesus, then we aren't doing our communities, the ones we're called to tend, to steward, right? We're not doing them favors. We're not being faithful to the gospel call. Does that make sense?
One of the things that I know about myself is that one of my Strength Finders gifts is persuasion, and so I tend to view all communication as some form of argument, and so that can get me in trouble. And because one path of argument is to get somebody else as mad as you are, and I sometimes observe that in our rostered leaders' behavior when they're angry about, and justifiably so, about some injustice, and maybe the path forward, at least the first inclination, is to basically a strategy in which basically states, I'm angry and I want you to get as angry as me. And often what they have is just a lot of anger and not a lot of movement. So I don't know. So I guess I'm making an argument, there you go, for artfulness, for how, like what you just said, understanding context, which I think is different than just simply meeting people where they're at. But
No, I would agree, and I think I think that one of the key pieces, that there are a number of key pieces that are playing into the tension and the conflict that are happening in our congregations these days. And I think one is, just as you've said, we have a Lutheran tradition of being quietistic, of avoiding the implications of the gospel as it's related to justification or justice, because we've been so focused on justification. But I think another piece is that we don't talk about theology and the meanings of words very often as we ought to. We use the language like everybody is assuming that we all are on the same page. But when I invite people to think about what is the gospel, we use that all the time. But I bet if you were to ask your council members, what is the gospel, you'd get 8 to 10, depending on how many people you've got around that table, different definitions of it, right? Same for God. Or heck, if you ask an atheist why she or he doesn't believe in God, I probably don't believe in that God either, right? But we use the term as if we all understand what it is. And so I think this is why it's really important to have opportunities to talk theology, so that we invite people to think about their faith. Like, again, theology doesn't matter unless it matters. And so what do people believe? Why do they believe it? Is it consistent within itself? And what difference does it make? And so I think sometimes we skate over those, and therefore we have inconsistencies and conflict that are avoidable if we were to have some pauses and say, okay, so this is what who do you understand Jesus to be? And just talk about that. And then, so this is the one whom you claim to be Savior. Yes. Okay. Is it possible to reconcile that with caging children? Just, and help them see you can do that, right? Is it possible to see Jesus's conversations with the Samaritans women, extending to nationalities that have been somehow or another otherwise dismissed, and reconciling with them, and also to believe in white supremacy? Can you do that? No, right? But how do you invite them into that rather than just telling? But inviting them to investigate. what are our stories and what are our terms and what difference does that make?
Sometimes, just in following up on Steve's comment on learning, I think sometimes I know as a parish pastor, I have made assumptions about where people are at and then learned that they're actually engaged in justice making or peacemaking in creative ways that I didn't even know about. So
Right.
it's good to poke around. You may find allies in unlikely places sometimes, or places where you can ally around certain matters.
Well, and I think another point, I mentioned some examples of in South Dakota. I was invited to teach our ELCA social statement about caring for creation, which, oops, sorry, are you still there? I was
Yeah.
invited to ask or to teach a congregation in Sioux Falls our ELCA document on caring for creation, which is a marvelous statement. And in the statement, it stated, it states that we are to try to eat more or lower on the food chain, so more vegetarian food. Holy smokes, I had somebody sitting in that congregation and they had a beef farm, West River. And so they said, wait a minute, is my ELCA telling me that my vocation is against the reign of God, right? Or the gambling issue that is such a pressing matter in South Dakota. And while we might be able to all agree that gambling causes tremendous harm in our society, you try and be the pastor in Deadwood who proclaims that it's not of the church, right? So there's a way to be nimble and attentive, I think, to recognize that that we can't just preach the gospel and preach about justice and not see that there are effects of that that can be painful. And so to notice and attend to the loss. There's an amazing author named Anand Giridharadas. He wrote recently a book called Winners Take All, and he has done some remarkable work these days dealing with how do we upend white supremacy, but also attend to some of the disorientation that is, and the loss of, and the grief, the loss of a way of life, which is actually quite pastoral while also being prophetic.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? I know it's hard to in a large group, but want to give you opportunity. So we're going to imagine some ways that we can be supportive of one another in our prophetic work as well as our pastoral work. I agree with Dr. Anna, there isn't really a dichotomy there. There should not be. The way in which I walk in that contributes to injustice in the world also dehumanizes me, and my pastor would be remiss if he or she did not help me with that. And so I think that it's true that it's right there in your letter of call and in our ELCA constitutions that this is a part of a big part of what we're called to do. It's one of the reasons why we're structured the way we are. If you're a called pastor, it's fairly difficult for the congregation to remove you because they don't like what you're telling them. There are other reasons that are easier, and but we're not talking about those today. And so, Pastor Dr. Reverend Anna, thank you so much for your time with us today. Thank you, Rich. Yep, thank you for that, Rich. The last author mentioned Martin Niemöller. Okay.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Martin Niemöller. And then Kai Munk, he was a Danish playwright, actually, but also a pastor. And the Nazis warned him to quit preaching against Hitler and his treatment of any number of people, including the Jews. Kai Munk refused to stop. And he was taken out of the parsonage, right? Out of the parsonage in the middle of the night and shot and killed. My great uncle was Kai Munk's bestie, he and two other people, and they went out hunting regularly in these same woods. and it was he and two friends who found Kai Munk's body. There's an amazing story about that. If you go to the blog and just look up Kai, K-A-J, Kai Munk, he's a source of tremendous inspiration. And he speaks, by the way, he has this marvelous quote. Could you give me like 30 seconds to quick look up this quote?
Yeah.
Because I think it's relevant here. I'm almost there. Munk, there we go. Kai Munk. He says this. He wrote this. What is therefore our task today? I don't know why I didn't think about this earlier. What is therefore our task today? Shall I answer faith, hope, and love? That sounds beautiful, but I would say courage. No, even that is not challenging enough to be the whole truth. Our task today is recklessness. For what we Christians lack is not psychology or literature. We lack a holy rage, the recklessness which comes from the knowledge of God and humanity. The ability to rage when justice lies prostrate on the streets, and when the lie rages across the face of the earth, a holy anger about the things that are wrong in the world. To rage against the ravaging of God's earth and the destruction of God's world. To rage when little children must die of hunger, when the tables of the rich are sagging with food. To rage at the senseless killing of so many, and against the madness of militaries. To rage at the lie that calls the threat of death and the strategy of destruction peace. To rage against complacency. To restlessly seek that recklessness that will challenge and seek and change human history until it conforms to the norms of the kingdom of God. And remember, the signs of the Christian church have been the lion, the lamb, the dove, and the fish, but never the chameleon, right? That's astonishing. That's goosebumpy. And that was written in the late 30s, early 40s.
Wow.
And so Kai Munk would be a tremendous inspiration, I think, for us these days too.
You know, one of our core values is love that makes a difference, which is this good Lutheran understanding of love, that what matters, that good intentions are no good unless it actually yields some good results for our neighbor. And that can be really hard, even the most well-meaning activity to act on behalf of neighbor can go awry. And it's not real love if it doesn't actually yield a good result. And so, and I think that's part of our challenge, right? Is how do we do this in a way that actually advances the gospel and actually frees people.
Right. You're also, maybe I'm missing a question here. I don't, interrupt me if there's a question that's posed.
No, there wasn't really. It was more of a reflection on what we're talking about.
You mentioned the word knowledge, and that word intrigues me a lot. In English, we just have one word, knowledge, right? That kind of does so I know you, and I know that it's warm outside, right? But in other languages, like German, there are two different verbs for that. So kennen, ich kenne dich, but ich wissen, ich weiß, dass es warm draußen ist. And in French, it's savoir and connaître. And in Spanish, it's conocer, I think conocer and saber. So they have these different nuances to the word knowledge, but then in Hebrew, we have the word yada, right? And that is to know sort of in the biblical sense, right? But it really is this deep incarnate, it's wisdom. That's what it is, right? And I think in a nerdy, geeky sort of way, the rumor has it that that's why George Lucas called Yoda Yoda, because it sounds like yada, right? And that's the Hebrew word yada. But I think maybe that gets to perhaps the earlier question about context and knowing the laity, right? Because there, as rostered leaders, we have knowledge, we have wir kennen was, we know things, and that is not to be dismissed, right? I mean, that is sacred stuff and calling to steward it. But we are also called to know, yes, we have it subject, wissen, but we also are called to know our people, kennen. And when we confuse those adeptly, then I think we have some wisdom to offer. And not just to offer, but also to inculcate, to encourage. And so knowledge, you know, it's a beautiful word, but it has so many different layers and facets and nuances that I think even that alone is worth playing with.
Thank you.
There was one question that I didn't want to get lost. With looking at preaching, would it be good to begin with a first person account? So do you recommend sharing from a first person point of view?
Yeah. Do you know, I think the short answer is yes, with a little bit of a gulp, because I am always a bit tentative when the sermons become about oneself rather than the gospel. However, there is an opportunity. I'm a word nerd, and so the word opportunity comes from the same word as porous, which is, it means a hole through which something comes through. And also, as a brief aside, I promise I'm going to answer the question, but I learned that in this awesome book written by a guy named Lewis Hyde called Trickster Makes the World. I think somebody else was wondering about the other author I mentioned, Anand Giridharadas. If you just look up Winners Take All, you'll find it. Look up anything and everything you can read by Anand Giridharadas. But this was from, I learned this root word, this etymology of opportunity in this book, Trickster Makes the World, in which this Lewis Hyde investigates the tricksters of literature, right? So the fox, for example, or Loki. And I read that book and I thought, that is so the Holy Spirit. She's a trickster, right? She, not malevolent, but mischievous, right? And in that same paragraph where I learned opportunity is a hole through which something comes, it's, you know, pours through. I also learned from him that the word kairos, which we use all the time in the church, originally came from the Greek knitting world. And a kairos was actually a hole through which the needle threaded something. So when we talk about a kairotic moment, I think we're talking about a moment through which something new can come. And I think in that sense, there is the opportunity to use a sermon as a kairotic moment to confess, right? To say, let me tell you about how I have come to understand my own white privilege, because then there's a solidarity that is created. I suppose at one level, that was sort of what I was doing when I wanted to say, I understand how scary it is. I'm a single parent, dependent on income from being a freelance theologian, which is nuts. And yet, I could not back down. And so as a result of that, I understand the risk. I have 2 dogs to protect us. But I feel like I can do no other. Here I stand like the book. And so I suppose that to one degree or another, that's what I was trying to do, even yet today, without consciously thinking about it. So as long as one doesn't make the sermon, I think, the proclamation about oneself, but uses it as an opportunity to get to a broader point, I would, in fact, encourage that, because then the rostered leader is seen not as preaching above and below, but rather with.
I hope we can have you back sometime, Anna. I'd love to, as we talked about, do a dialogue, not a debate, because I think it would be bad for our synod to see their bishop get trounced in a debate. But I do think it would be awesome to have a dialogue sometime.
I would love that.
We'll do this again.
I
have some stuff that I want to talk about. So thanks so much. Chris,
and
is there
the time? I appreciate that, and the invitation too.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. So, Chris, is there anything else we need to touch on before we head out?
just make sure you all read the Northern Lights that will come out tomorrow. So you'll see the links for small groups to join. You'll see the registration form for the pastoral care webinars. And then Pastor Carla put in something that we need members of the Constitution Committee. We need some people who love to dig into constitutions. So if you know of anyone like that, please email Pastor Carla Nicholson. Yeah, and tomorrow at 11, we'll join with the ELCA for their service of commemorating Emmanuel 9, remembering those who were killed 5 years ago. I think that's kind of all. Be a big Northern Lights tomorrow.
Killed by a member of an ELCA congregation.
Right.
Thank you, everyone, for your good work. God's peace be with you. May it be a holy and agitating peace, if that's a thing. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.